fun episode coming up. This is a conversation with my friend Tammy that I had in the spring back in Eugene, Oregon, where I had been living before I moved on up to Salem. And we just got together at a local bakery, New Day Bakery in the Wit. And so this recording was done live in person, and you can hear a little bit of dishes clanking and people moving about in the background because we did this one sitting outside on the patio with a salad and the reason I remember there was a salad there was because at one point I think even the microphone tipped over and the pop filter went into Tammy's salad. And I was very embarrassed because I assured her this was a legitimate show and a very worthwhile use of her time. So hopefully she forgives me for that and that I've done a good job putting it together. I think the topics she works on are fascinating, and especially as a fellow social psychologist, so we're in the same program, trained in the same field. Um, I think that the area of work she discusses, so understanding moral decision making as it relates to whistleblowing and calling out corruption, looking at these questions across cultures. I think it's some of the coolest work that could be done at this psychological level. I really mean that, and so I was pumped to have her on the show. And yeah, she's great. So put it on. Just a few minutes ago, you were telling me about some hypotheses you had on the reporting of transgressions and how that relates to corruption and sort of whistleblowing in different contexts. And I was wondering if you'd explain some of that to us and how you got interested in it.
Well, thank you, Alex, for having me in this. Um, yeah, so this project started with the question of why are there countries more corrupt than others and how that influences behavior within a community, right? How the prevalence of corruption can influence how people behave within a community. And the one aspect that my mentor and I back in Argentina when I was still an undergrad, the main thing we started asking about was the perception or the moral judgment of whistleblowing, or you can also call it tattletelling, um, because in Argentina, in my home country, there's a really bad view or a really bad perception of the idea of reporting a transgression by a peer to an authority figure, right? We even have a very despective term for tattletelling, which is also pretty despective in English too, right? Which is buchon. Yeah, it's a despective term. Um, so we were wondering why is that? Because if you think about the idea of reporting a transgression, in the end, it has a positive outcome, right? You're just avoiding transgressions to happen. But so why do we have such a bad perspective about that? So we started wondering how the the idea or the perception we have of the authority figure can affect that decision. And we sort of proposed an idea of, okay, it's like whether you want to be faithful to your peer, whether you want to stay close to your peers and protect them even if they committed a transgression, or if you want to be faithful to the authority.
Okay, so this idea of the prevalence of tattletaling, you could say, it sounds like it has a lot to do with your ideas of loyalty toward loyalty and the loyalty you'd feel toward your peer group versus the authority group. And so, what do you mean by that? Is there sort of a matter of trust in authority that comes into play?
Well, that's exactly what we were trying to answer. So the work I worked on was trying to study what aspects affect that view of whether you want to stay loyal to an authority or you want to stay loyal to a peer. So what we did a survey where we presented different scenarios of situations where people had to decide whether to report a transgression or not. And the things we varied in these scenarios were like there were cases where the person who was breaking the norm was, for example, someone very close to you, versus cases where the person who was transgressing the norm was someone that you didn't really know. So how close you are to the transgressor, how that affects your decision to report a transgression or not. Another factor that we varied was whether there was some kind of incentive from the authority towards the person who's going to report the transgression. So, whether the authority is offering a reward to who reports a transgression, or another kind of incentive that we were testing was instead of offering a reward, what if the authority threatens with a punishment if no one reports a certain transgression, right? And we found very interesting things on that. So actually, if the authority was offering a reward towards whoever reports a transgression, people had a very bad view about reporting the transgression.
Mm,
Yeah,
because you're sort of doing it for your own selfish, you
exactly.
could make a buck out of it.
Exactly. However, with the incentive that was sort of a threat of punishment, and in the stories that we worked with, it was the authority figure was threatening of a punishment to the whole group if no one reported a transgression. So then reporting the transgression was seen as a good thing. People thought it was a good decision because, in a way, you were sort of saving the group from that punishment. So that's interesting because there has been some work in politics of wanting to encourage reporting certain transgressions, and in many cases, they were trying rewards, right? So it might be interesting to see whether other kind of measurements could work for that. Yeah.
And your work suggests that that is a nice incentive in some cases,
Mhm.
but it has to be punish the whole group, not just
Yeah,
pay out to one.
exactly.
Huh. And what kinds of examples do you all use in this research? Is it a lot of in this political context, corruption, whistleblowing?
So in the one work we did, and again, this is the only work I've done, and I wish I can work with other kind of situations too. But in the work we've done, we actually work with the stories that were about kids in schools. Um, and
So these really are tattletale
yes,
stories.
exactly. And the reason we worked on that, it was, well, at the beginning we even thought of doing a developmental work and actually also studying this in kids and how kids are being educated about these ideas. But we did it with adults, but the stories were about kids in schools. And it's actually, I think it has been good because people judging kids or situations of kids, I think people are more comfortable being honest on their views about these moral dilemmas. While if I could put them to think about something that they could actually do, they probably are not completely honest about their perspective. So that I think that was actually good. And again, it was one small study that I did for my honors thesis. So I'm looking forward to keep on collecting data on that, and probably also not only using stories about kids, but probably testing other kind of situations.
Yeah, I could see how this sort of work would be relevant to so many situations. You brought up the example earlier of just getting pulled over for speeding on the street.
Exactly.
Right. Why don't we sort this out between us? You could,
Exactly.
yeah. So, in addition to that, do you see any particular direction for this work in your upcoming research? Are there some avenues that you have really locked in on?
Yeah, well, a lot of different avenues. On one side, well, thinking of how to apply the research more in the long term, I think one of those scenarios could be, for example, school settings. And I think there's a lot of lack of report in, for example, high school settings where situations of bullying or even sexual assault, where there is not much reporting from the actual students to the authorities. So, kind of, if my idea is right, is if you don't trust the authority to report a transgression to, maybe something that should be worked on is the perception that students have of the authority figure, right? And feeling like it's someone they can go and report. So that could be a future application. But then, in more regards of the research, one route that I could take is to cross-cultural study, and especially studying countries with different levels of corruption, and including into that study not only studying the moral judgment of reporting a transgression, but also asking people about their perception of corruption in the country they're living in. Um, so, in I think the closest thing I could do is work with Argentina, where I'm still working with researchers there. So, keep on collecting data here, there, and collecting data here in the U.S. And I actually met some researchers who are working on moral judgment of whistleblowing in Germany. So there I could already have like three countries who are pretty different on these different aspects. And
Yeah. Do you have any hypotheses about what cultural differences you might observe when it comes to this process you describe, where some incentives work better than others? Might that be this sort of group punishment effect, but not individual reward? Do you have an idea or a suspicion about what what might be different elsewhere or why?
yeah, so I definitely predicted probably in the US that could be different. I feel the US culture is a lot more individualistic. So probably the idea of a reward to the one person that reports a transgression might actually be effective in this culture.
And I think what's implied in that is that in a more collectivist culture like those of Argentina, that individual reward strategies would play quite differently. And we saw that was the case in her description of her thesis work. And so it's really interesting to me to think about these interconnections between the culture of a place and how that would influence which incentives would be more or less effective in that place at persuading people to report transgressions, which is presumably something we want people to be able to do. So, in collectivist culture, sort of running with this working theory, it seems as though putting that onus on the whole group through punishment or perhaps reward in some cases would be the more sensible way in a collectivist culture. But I'm sure there's a lot more to that and more aspects to break down. A little bit more nuance there than I could put into words right now. And so that's why I hope maybe we could have Tammy back on the show, perhaps when some of these future studies are completed, to see what she found and to have her articulate the ways culture and reporting interact a bit more, because I really love that. And I love too her nod to applications in a university and workplace reporting settings as one example of where we could really see the importance of this at the institutional level, at that level of the culture in an institution, how it comes into play in encouraging people to speak up. And that's really important stuff. So I hope that her work is fruitful and helps lend a hand in that effort. So thanks for listening to this shorty but a goodie here, under 15 minutes with Tammy.